are talking Dampyr from 2022, and this is an Italian production based on a comic book. I must admit I am not familiar with the comic book, so I'm only judging this based on this one movie. So an Italian production but spoken in English and filmed in Romania, and is essentially what I presume is the start of a film series. I said very much this is a setup movie if I've ever seen one. And obviously with a comic, obviously you've got a heap of source material there, so it very much feels like it's would broadly be kind of going on the same path as the comic, I would assume. Now it takes place in the 90s and primarily is set in the Balkans, and we follow a guy called Harlan who is at the beginning of the movie actually pretending to be a Dampyr, even though he doesn't really know what that is, but essentially it's a half human, half vampire who can, you know, put to rest vampires essentially. And he's there with his manager, who it's heavily implied is his lover as well, and they're kind of basically just ripping people off. However, he really is a Dampyr. He just doesn't know it yet. He was the offspring of a powerful vampire that we see in a prologue that was separated. And Dampyrs are rare in this world because their blood is deadly to vampires and can kill them more or less instantly. So if a Dampyr is ever kind of created, and they're created when a vampire essentially gets a human woman pregnant, begs the reason why anyone would do that, but there you go. They're essentially normally killed at birth because they pose such a threat to vampires. But this one, he was protected by 3 witches, I presume. At least that's what the prologue suggests. And he is now grown up to an adult. And he ends up getting involved in this kind of like this war in the Balkans that's kind of going on that partially involves vampires. And he ends up teaming up with a soldier and a vampire who is trying to rid herself of the control of her master to try and essentially take out this big bad vampire, this Lord Vampire, played by really the only recognisable face I've seen in this movie, played by David Morrissey, who you may know as the governor from The Walking Dead. And, well, what will happen? You have to watch the movie and find out. So, let's discuss what works with this movie. And as I've said, I haven't read the comics, so this is purely going to be, but from my perspective, as a film rather than as an adaptation of existing source material. So, what works in this movie? It is a very stylistic movie in a lot of ways. And it does feel, I have to say, very much like a comic in some ways. I think they've done a good job here of portraying this kind of stylized kind of hyper reality into a kind of a movie format. You don't quite think this is really kind of taking place in our world, so to speak. Everything is seems a little bit kind of exaggerated and kind of like, as I say, over kind of stylized, but it gives it this really kind of like 90s feel. And this movie is set in the 90s, bear in mind, but it was obviously made recently. But it definitely has a kind of a 90s aesthetic in regards to its kind of attitudes towards movies like this. But it has this kind of like 90s cool factor, if you know what I mean. That is 90s cool in 2023? Well, that's for up to you to decide. But it looks slick, it looks polished. You know, there's some fantastic kind of cinematography here. I mean, this movie does look gorgeous. I mean, it being filmed in Romania, it really has that sort of somewhat of a gothic feel to it. You know, and we have this kind of this war-torn kind of Balkans area, and it looks kind of like it's been decimated, and all this destruction, and we just see like piles of bodies and stuff. So the production design here really is quite impressive. I mean, for example, we go to this we have this we introduce our human characters, this bunch of soldiers, and they go to this town. There's just like piles of bodies, all of which have but presumably been drained of blood by vampires. It looks great, but they've got these wide open, like, you know, like shots and things like that. So it really does feel like the production is quite lavish. It feels like a relatively kind of high budgeted kind of produced kind of film. I don't know what the budget was from it, but it certainly feels like, at least from a production standpoint, you know, it's quite impressive with large numbers of extras, you know, impressive production design, great, you know, set design, costumes, things like that, prosthetics, loads of VFX. Our main bad guy Gorka, played by David Morrissey, has this kind of constant kind of swirl of kind of like black fire and stuff that's kind of going around him. It looks a bit like Snape from Harry Potter, but there you go. You know, it is what it is, I suppose. So yeah, it looks fantastic. It really does look like highly stylized, highly polished, and kind of looks like a comic book come to life in many ways. I have to say I quite liked our trio of protagonists. You know, our kind of main guy Harlan, who is this Dampyr. As I say, he's more of your everyman that's to start with, or at least he thinks he is. So he comes across as your POV character, as someone who is initially kind of out of their depth, but quite a likeable character. We've got our battle-hardened kind of soldier bloke who's very prickly on the outside, but you learn he's actually kind of quite kind of loyal and has a kind of code of conduct. And we have our female vampire who, you know, is interesting. I don't think she's particularly well realised in regards to her character, because I don't really quite understand why she became a good guy, to be honest with you. I don't think it's particularly well handled, but, you know, nonetheless, I think she looks cool and she's got some good action sequences and things like that. There are some, you know, well choreographed action sequences with lots of kind of wire work. The vampire makeup looks quite good, and it does use CGI, but it's incorporated well. You know, vampires are getting sort of burnt up and stuff, and there's some fun sequences where, you know, Harlan's blood, who is a vampire, it gets confusing, I know. His blood is essentially toxic to vampires. They kind of are dipping bullets in blood and stuff to be able to shoot vampires and stuff, which makes some pretty decent kind of action sequences. I think it very much points to a larger world. We have Harlan's actual father, who is also a Lord Vampire, is out there somewhere, certainly being set up for kind of sequels. We have these three kind of witch women that really don't have much explanation, I have to say, but they're there as well, and they can pop up a couple of times in the movie. And, you know, just the kind of the obviously being set in the kind of the Balkan War and stuff, you know, makes it for this kind of war-torn and you know, an interesting kind of backdrop. The vampire mythology is you know, it's kind of interesting, I would say. You know, we have these Lord vampires who are the only ones that can kind of turn other vampires, and our Gorka, our kind of our main bad guy here, he's basically making his own army, being kind of set up in this kind of like war zone and stuff, and turning soldiers to become these kind of personal army and stuff. So there's some fun and interesting stuff, and I will say, if you like just a kind of like a visual treat, this movie really delivers on that front, you know, and I think it has some kind of interesting characters and good action sequences. So visually speaking, this movie is pretty good. Where it falls down for me, we had to talk about some negatives, I think it's some of the sort of the setup here. And I'm assuming this may have been a bit more expanded in the comics, but like, to me, some stuff here is just kind of skipped over. So I've mentioned one of our three protagonists, this kind of female vampire. I don't really get why she ended up rebelling against her master. It's never really like shown that she's in sort of turmoil, or she's kind of tempted, or she's kind of, you know, she's trying to get away. She just does. She's sort of she hangs around with these guys to spy them initially, but then she just goes, yeah, I'm on your side now, and it's never really built in. So I didn't really think that was particularly good writing, I have to say. And then we have these witches, and then the whole kind of idea of you know, the circumstance of how this kind of vampire, the father of our main character Harlan, how he's got this kind of like human woman pregnant. Why would he do that? Did he rape her? Was it like consensual? You know, did he want a son? Did he not? It's just not explained. It's just kind of there. Now, as I've said, I think this may have been maybe expanded upon in the comics. I don't know, or whether they're kind of setting up for future movies. Again, I don't know. But for this movie, just watching it cold with no other kind of like source of material to look at here, it feels a little incomplete, I have to say. So you really feel like you have to accept, yeah, these are things that are happening, and don't worry about it. They're just happening. So it feels a little like there's some information that is missing in this film. So as a complete film, I think it could have been, it had a little bit more well-rounded, a little bit more accessible, and a little bit more kind of, you know, exposition even could have been given, or explanation about what the actual kind of setup is here. And there's some things as well I was just scratching my head about. It's like, well, if at the beginning of the movie, Harlan, our main guy, who ends up being a vampire, how has he ended up pretending to be one if he doesn't even know what was to begin with? It just doesn't make sense in some ways. The other thing I would say, I mean, that I've mentioned this as a 90s film. What also has a 90s feel is the dialogue. The dialogue here is like, oh God, it's really, I mean, it's just like 90s like macho dialogue. And in 2023, when I feel like audiences are a little bit more sophisticated, and I don't know if they want a little bit more from nuanced characters and kind of more well realised characters, and just like some of the trite and quite frankly cheesy dialogue is a little bit like, oh God, that's straight out of the 90s. You know, particularly from Gorka, who is our bad guy. He's just like, David Morrissey, as I say, he's really the only recognisable actor for me. But he comes up with some clangers. I mean, it's not his fault. He's just saying what is written for him. But it's just like, God. I mean, the dialogue here is just like, ooh. But you don't really know much about him. I actually thought he was the father initially, but again, I think this movie could have had a little jiggling around to kind of like make the story a little bit more coherent. It's not like a hard story to follow, but there are some small plot threads here that just I feel could have been better expanded upon. So there's a little bit of obvious kind of wire work sometimes. I mean, it's quite impressive to look at as a movie because it's so kind of visually interesting, and some of the stunt work is good, but a little bit of it just looks like wire work at times. But overall, I've got to say I found this movie quite entertaining despite some of its kind of shortcomings. And if you don't mind some kind of 90s cheese, then I think maybe you would want to check this one out. It's maybe not as deep as I would have liked, or as kind of nuanced maybe, but it still is quite a visually striking film with some decent kind of world building, and visually speaking it looks great, and some interesting characters. But I would have liked to have them to maybe looked at maybe one film first before really trying to kind of like think, oh yeah, we're going to make a series of films and have it as just one kind of like film with a start to it, and if it does well, make a sequel, but have this one a little bit more self-contained, because I feel this was a little bit like, oh, we'll leave some stuff for the sequel. But I liked it. I thought it was fun. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.